She didn't scream when the first blow landed. That was the part that haunted her father later, when he replayed that night in his mind, over and over, like a horror film he couldn't turn off. His daughter, Caroline, 26 years old, pregnant with her first child, hadn't screamed. She had taken the hit in silence, crumpling to the marble floor of a penthouse worth more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes. The silence was worse than any cry for help could have been. It meant she had learned not to expect mercy. But her father, Thomas Brennan, didn't know any of this yet. Not on that cold November evening when he sat in his modest living room in Portland, flipping through the channels with a beer growing warm in his hand. He was a simple man, a contractor, calloused hands, weathered face, the kind of guy who believed in hard work and keeping your word. He had raised Caroline alone after her mother died of cancer when Caroline was only 9. He had done his best, taught her to be kind, taught her to be strong, taught her never to settle for less than she deserved. And then she met Julian Hargrave. Thomas had known from the first moment he shook Julian's hand that something was wrong. It wasn't anything he could put his finger on, not at first. Julian was polite, well-dressed, came from a family that owned half the commercial real estate in Manhattan. He smiled at all the right times, said all the right things, but his eyes were cold, empty, like looking into the windows of an abandoned house. Before we continue, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and let us know where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel, and trust me, this one will make you think twice, because it could happen to anyone. Caroline had been working as an event coordinator at a high-end hotel in New York when they met. Julian had come in for a charity gala his family was hosting. He had pursued her with the kind of intensity that most people mistake for passion. Flowers every day, private dinners at restaurants with 6-month waiting lists, weekend trips to Paris, to Monaco, to places Caroline had only seen in magazines. He had swept her off her feet, and she had fallen hard. Thomas had tried to warn her, gently at first, then more directly. "Something about that boy doesn't sit right with me, Caro," he had said one night over the phone, a few months into their relationship. "Dad, you don't even know him," she had replied, her voice already defensive, already distant. "I know enough. I know how he looks at you. Like you're something he owns, not someone he loves." There had been a long pause on the other end of the line. Then quietly, "You're wrong about him." But Thomas wasn't wrong. He had just been powerless to do anything about it. The wedding had been a spectacle. 400 guests, a venue in the Hamptons that cost more than Thomas's house. Caroline had looked beautiful in her dress. But when Thomas walked her down the aisle, he had felt her hand trembling in the crook of his arm. He had leaned in close, whispered, "You don't have to do this, sweetheart. We can walk right back out that door. Right now." She had smiled, a sad, brittle smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I love him, Dad." And that had been that. For the first year, things seemed fine. Caroline called less often, but when she did, she sounded happy. Or at least, she sounded like she was trying to be happy. She talked about the penthouse, about charity events, about Julian's business ventures. She didn't talk about Julian himself much. Thomas noticed, but he didn't push. He told himself he was being paranoid, that he needed to let his daughter live her own life. Then, 6 months ago, Caroline had called with news that made Thomas's heart soar. "Dad," she had said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I'm pregnant." Thomas had felt tears prick his eyes. "Oh, Caro, that's wonderful. That's just wonderful." "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice small. "But I'm happy. I think this is going to change everything. I think Julian is going to be different now. He seems excited. He's already talking about names, about setting up a nursery. It's like he's a different person." Thomas had wanted to believe it. God, how he had wanted to believe it. But 3 weeks ago, Caroline stopped calling. At first, Thomas told himself she was just busy. Pregnancy was exhausting, he knew that. And the Hargraves were probably keeping her occupied with their endless social obligations. But after 10 days of silence, he started to worry. He texted. He called. He left voicemails. Nothing. Finally, he called the penthouse directly. A housekeeper answered. "I'm looking for my daughter, Caroline Hargrave," Thomas said. "Is she there?" There was a pause. Then, carefully, "Mrs. Hargrave is resting. She asked not to be disturbed." "Resting? For 10 days?" "I'm sorry, sir. That's all I can tell you." Thomas had hung up with a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones, the same way he had felt it the first time he met Julian. He booked a flight to New York that same day. The penthouse was in Tribeca, all glass and steel and sweeping views of the city. Thomas had been there twice before, once for a dinner party, once for Caroline's birthday. Both times he had felt out of place, like a stain on expensive fabric. This time, he didn't care how he looked or what anyone thought. He just needed to see his daughter. The doorman tried to stop him. "I'm sorry, sir, but Mr. and Mrs. Hargrave aren't receiving visitors." Thomas stepped closer, his voice low and hard. "That's my daughter up there, and I'm going to see her. You can let me up, or I can make a scene that'll have every news camera in Manhattan pointed at this building by morning. Your choice." The doorman hesitated, then picked up the phone. A brief, hushed conversation. Then, reluctantly, 23rd floor. Thomas rode the elevator in silence, his heart pounding. When the doors opened, he was greeted not by Caroline but by Julian. Julian looked immaculate, as always. Tailored suit, perfect hair, that same cold smile. "Thomas, this is unexpected." "Where's Caroline?" "She's resting. She hasn't been feeling well. I want to see her." "I'm afraid that's not possible right now. The doctor has advised." Thomas didn't wait to hear the rest. He pushed past Julian, striding down the hallway toward the master bedroom. Julian called after him, his voice sharp, but Thomas didn't stop. He found her in the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing. She looked broken. Her face was a landscape of bruises, yellowing on her cheekbones, still purple around her left eye. Her lip was split, scabbed over. She was thin, far too thin for someone 5 months pregnant, and she was holding her stomach with both hands, rocking slightly. Thomas felt the world tilt. "Caro," he whispered. She looked up at him, and for a moment he saw recognition flicker in her eyes. Then shame. She looked away quickly, pulling her sleeves down over her wrists, but not before he saw the bruises there too. Finger-shaped, the marks of hands that had gripped too tight. "Dad, you shouldn't be here." Thomas's voice broke. "What did he do to you?" "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Please, just go. If he sees you here." "I'm not going anywhere." Thomas crossed the room, kneeling in front of her, taking her hands in his. They were ice cold. "Come with me, right now. We'll leave. I'll take you home." "I can't." "Yes, you can. Dad, stop." She pulled her hands away, wrapping her arms around herself. "You don't understand. It's not that simple. He's hurting you. That's all I need to understand." She laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "He's a Hargrave. Do you know what that means? His family has lawyers, judges, politicians, people who owe them favors. If I leave, if I try to take this baby away from him, they'll destroy me. They'll make sure I never see my child. They'll paint me as unstable, as a gold digger, as whatever they need me to be to win. I have nothing. No money of my own. No career anymore." He made sure of that. Thomas felt rage building in his chest, hot and violent. Then I'll... You'll what? Caroline's voice was sharp now, desperate. You'll fight the Hargraves? With what? You're a contractor, Dad. You're a good man, but you don't have the resources to take them on. They'll bury you, and they'll bury me, and my baby will grow up thinking I abandoned them. Thomas wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she was wrong, that there was always a way, that justice always prevailed. But he had lived long enough to know that wasn't true. The world didn't work that way. Money bought silence, money bought protection, money bought the right to hurt people without consequence. Still, he couldn't leave her here. Then let me stay, he said quietly. Just for a few days. Let me make sure you're safe. Caroline opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Julian appeared in the doorway. I think it's time for you to leave, Thomas. Thomas stood slowly, turning to face his son-in-law. Up close, he could see it now, the cruelty that had always been there, hidden behind the charm. It was in the set of Julian's jaw, the flatness of his gaze, the way he stood like a man who had never been told no in his entire life. I'm not leaving without my daughter. Julian smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. Yes, you are. And that was when Thomas saw it. The flicker of something dark and satisfied in Julian's expression. The look of a man who enjoyed having power over others, who enjoyed inflicting pain. Thomas took a step forward, but Caroline grabbed his arm. Dad, please, don't make this worse. Thomas looked down at her, at the fear in her eyes, and felt something inside him break. He wanted to fight, wanted to tear Julian apart with his bare hands, but Caroline was right. Fighting now would only hurt her more. So he left. But as he rode the elevator back down, as he walked out into the cold New York night, Thomas made himself a promise. He was going to save his daughter, no matter what it took. Thomas didn't sleep on the flight back to Portland. He sat in his cramped economy seat, staring out at the darkness beyond the window, his mind racing through every possible option. He could call the police, but what would he tell them? That his daughter had bruises? Julian would have a dozen explanations ready. A fall down the stairs, an accident. Caroline was clumsy in her pregnancy. The Hargraves would have doctors lined up to corroborate whatever story they needed. Money had a way of making inconvenient truths disappear. He could hire a lawyer, but with what money? Thomas had savings, sure. Enough to cover emergencies, to help Caroline if she ever needed it. But going up against the Hargrave legal machine? That would cost hundreds of thousands, maybe millions. They would drag it out, bury him in motions and appeals until he had nothing left. He could go public, contact the media, expose Julian for what he was. But that would destroy Caroline, too. The tabloids would tear her apart. She would become a spectacle, a headline, her pain turned into entertainment for millions of strangers. And the Hargraves would still win. They always won. By the time the plane touched down, Thomas had made a decision. He was going to watch. He was going to wait. And he was going to gather evidence. Because eventually, Julian would slip up. Men like him always did. They got arrogant. They got careless. And when that moment came, Thomas would be ready. He just prayed Caroline would survive long enough for him to save her. For the next 2 weeks, Thomas called Caroline every day. She rarely answered, and when she did, her voice was hollow, distant. She spoke in careful, measured words, the kind of sentences people use when they know someone else is listening. Thomas could picture Julian standing nearby, monitoring every word, and it made his blood boil. "I'm fine, Dad," she would say. "Really, I was just tired before. Pregnancy is harder than I expected. Carol, please, let me come see you." "That's not a good idea right now. Julian has been under a lot of stress with work. It's better if we keep things calm." Julian's stress, not hers. never hers. Thomas wanted to scream, but he kept his voice level, kept the conversation light. He told her about projects he was working on, about the weather in Portland, about anything that might make her feel less alone. And at the end of every call, he said the same thing. I love you, sweetheart, and I'm here. Whenever you need me, day or night, I'm here. Sometimes she said it back. Sometimes she just hung up. On the 15th day, Thomas's phone rang at 2:30 in the morning. He jerked awake, heart hammering, and grabbed for it in the darkness. Caroline's name flashed on the screen. Caro? For a moment, there was only breathing on the other end, ragged, wet, the sound of someone trying not to sob. Caro, talk to me. What's wrong? Dad. Her voice was barely a whisper. I need you to come. Please. Thomas was already out of bed, pulling on clothes with one hand. I'm coming. Right now. Are you hurt? Do you need an ambulance? No. No ambulances. No police, please. Just come. Where's Julian? He's gone. Business trip. London. He left this afternoon. Thomas felt a surge of relief so intense it made him dizzy. Okay. Okay, baby. I'm getting dressed right now. I'm going to drive to the airport and catch the first flight out. I'll be there in a few hours. Can you hold on that long? I think so. A pause. Then, so quietly, he almost didn't hear it. I'm bleeding. The world stopped. What? There's blood. Not a lot, but enough. And I have cramps. Bad ones. Dad, something's wrong. Something's wrong with the baby. Thomas was moving faster now, grabbing his wallet, his keys, his jacket. Listen to me, Caroline. You need to go to the hospital. Right now. I can't. If Julian finds out, I don't give a damn what Julian finds out. Thomas's voice was sharp, desperate. Your baby is in danger. You're in danger. You need medical help. He'll know. The hospital will call him. They always call the husband first. And then he'll come back and nothing. I'll be there before he can get back from London. We'll figure this out. But you need to go to the hospital now, Caroline. Promise me. Another pause. Then a broken whisper. Okay. Which hospital? Mount Sinai, the one on 5th Avenue. I'm calling you a car right now. You're going to pack a bag, just the essentials, and you're going to get in that car and go to the emergency room. Tell them you're having pregnancy complications. They'll take care of you. I'll be on the next flight. I'll be there before morning. Do you understand? Yes. I love you, baby girl. I love you too, Dad. The line went dead. Thomas called a car service while he drove to the Portland airport, his hands shaking on the wheel. He called the airline. There was a red-eye leaving in 90 minutes. He bought a ticket on his phone, not even looking at the price. Money didn't matter. Nothing mattered except getting to his daughter. The flight was agony. 5 hours of sitting in the dark, imagining every worst-case scenario. What if she didn't make it to the hospital? What if she collapsed in the penthouse alone with no one to help her? What if the baby... No, he couldn't think like that. She had promised. She was going to the hospital. She was going to be okay. But in his gut, Thomas knew. He had known from the moment he heard her voice on the phone. Something terrible had happened, something worse than bruises, worse than broken ribs or split lips. Julian had gone too far. The plane landed at JFK at 7:42 in the morning. Thomas ran through the terminal, his carry-on bag slamming against his leg, and threw himself into the first taxi he could find. Mount Sinai on 5th Avenue, as fast as you can. The driver, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, must have heard something in Thomas's voice. He didn't ask questions. He just drove. The city was waking up around them. Joggers in Central Park, delivery trucks double-parked on narrow streets, coffee shops opening their doors. It all felt surreal, like the world was continuing on, normal and mundane, while Thomas's life was falling apart. He tried calling Caroline. No answer. He called again. Nothing. The hospital loomed ahead, a massive complex of glass and concrete. Thomas threw cash at the driver without counting it and sprinted through the entrance. The emergency room was chaos. Sick people, crying children, nurses moving with practiced efficiency. Thomas pushed his way to the front desk, ignoring the protests of people in line behind him. "My daughter, Caroline Hargrave. She came in a few hours ago. Pregnancy complications. Where is she?" The nurse, a young woman with tired eyes, typed something into her computer. "Are you family?" "I'm her father. Thomas Brennan." More typing. Then a glance up at him that made his stomach drop. "She's in surgery right now, 3rd floor, but you'll need to—" Thomas was already moving. He found the surgical wing and was immediately stopped by a security guard, an older man, gray-haired with a no-nonsense expression. "Sir, you can't go back there. My daughter is in surgery. I need to see her. You'll have to wait here. The doctors will update you as soon as— I need to see her now." The guard's expression softened slightly. "I understand. But the best thing you can do for her right now is wait here. Let the doctors do their job." Thomas wanted to argue, wanted to push past him and find Caroline himself, but he knew it was pointless. So he did the only thing he could do. He waited. The surgical waiting area was small and sterile. Uncomfortable plastic chairs, fluorescent lights that hummed overhead, a television in the corner playing the morning news on mute. Thomas sat with his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands, and prayed. He wasn't a religious man, hadn't been to church since his wife's funeral. But he prayed anyway. To God, to the universe. To anyone who might be listening. Please, please don't take her from me. Don't take that baby. They're all I have left. An hour passed, then 2. Finally, a doctor emerged. A woman in her 50s, surgical mask pulled down around her neck, exhaustion written across her face. "Family of Caroline Hargrave?" Thomas stood so fast his vision blurred. "I'm her father. Is she—" "She's stable, but there were complications." The way she said it made Thomas's knees weak. "What kind of complications?" The doctor gestured to a quieter corner of the waiting area, away from the other families. When she spoke again, her voice was low, professional. But there was anger underneath it. The kind of anger doctors feel when they see something that should never have happened. "Your daughter suffered severe abdominal trauma, blunt force, multiple contusions to the abdomen, lower back, and rib cage. The trauma caused placental abruption. The placenta separated from the uterine wall. We did everything we could, but—" Thomas felt the words before she said them, felt them like a physical blow. "The baby didn't survive. I'm sorry." The floor seemed to tilt beneath him. Thomas reached out, gripping the back of a chair to steady himself. "No. No, that's— Are you sure? I'm so sorry." The doctor's voice was gentle now. "We performed an emergency C-section, but the fetal heartbeat had already stopped by the time your daughter arrived. There was nothing we could do." Thomas couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. His grandbaby. His first grandbaby. Gone. "What about Caroline? She's alive. She's going to recover physically, but Mr. Brennan—" The doctor hesitated. "The injuries your daughter sustained were not consistent with a fall or an accident. Someone hurt her, badly." Thomas looked up, meeting the doctor's eyes. She knew. Of course she knew. Doctors saw this kind of thing all the time. Women who came in with injuries that didn't match their stories. Women who were too scared to tell the truth. I need to see her. She's still in recovery, but yes, I'll have a nurse take you to her room. The recovery room was quiet. Dimmed lights. The steady beep of monitors. Caroline was in the bed, pale and small under white sheets. An IV in her arm. Oxygen tube under her nose. Her eyes were closed, but Thomas could tell she wasn't sleeping. Her face was too tense, too aware. He pulled a chair close to the bed and took her hand. Caro, I'm here, baby. I'm right here. Her eyes opened slowly. For a moment, she just stared at him. Then tears began to slide down her temples, into her hair. I lost the baby. I know. I'm so sorry. It was a girl. Her voice cracked. They told me before the surgery. It was a girl. Thomas felt his own tears coming now, hot and unstoppable. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. He killed her. Caroline's hand tightened around his. Julian killed her. And he's going to get away with it. No. Thomas's voice was hard, final. No, he's not. Caroline looked at him, and something in her expression changed. The defeat that had been there moments ago was replaced by something else, something sharp and cold. What are you going to do? Thomas didn't answer right away. He just sat there holding his daughter's hand, feeling the rage build inside him like a fire. He had spent his whole life being a good man, following the rules, believing in the system. But the system had failed Caroline. It had failed his granddaughter. Sometimes, he realized, being a good man wasn't enough. Sometimes, you had to become something else. I'm going to make sure he pays for what he did, Thomas said quietly. I promise you, Caro. He's going to pay. And in that moment, in that quiet hospital room with his broken daughter and his dead grandbaby, Thomas Brennan made a decision that would change everything. He was going to destroy Julian Hargrave. Julian returned from London 3 days later. Thomas was there when he arrived at the hospital. He had been there every hour since Caroline came out of surgery, sleeping in the chair beside her bed, leaving only to use the bathroom or grab terrible coffee from the cafeteria. The nurses had stopped trying to send him home. They could see it in his eyes. He wasn't going anywhere. Caroline had barely spoken since she woke up. She lay in the bed, staring at the ceiling, one hand resting on her empty stomach. Sometimes she cried. Mostly, she was just silent. The kind of silence that comes after something inside you has broken so completely that there's nothing left to say. Thomas sat beside her, holding her hand, and planned. He had spent 3 days thinking. 3 days letting the rage simmer and crystallize into something cold and methodical. He couldn't just attack Julian, not physically, not legally. The Hargraves would crush him. But there were other ways to destroy a man. Thomas had learned that much in his 58 years on this earth. Everyone had secrets. Everyone had vulnerabilities. He just needed to find Julian's. When Julian walked through the door of Caroline's hospital room, he looked perfect. Expensive suit, fresh haircut, carrying a bouquet of white roses. His face was arranged in an expression of concern, but Thomas saw it. That flicker of something underneath. Relief. Relief that the baby was gone. Caroline, Julian said softly, moving to the bedside. I came as soon as I heard. I'm so sorry. The doctor said it was a placental abruption? That's just... God, that's terrible luck. Luck. He called it luck. Thomas stood slowly from his chair, placing himself between Julian and Caroline. You need to leave. Julian's expression shifted. The concern melted away, replaced by cool annoyance. "Excuse me? You heard me. Get out. This is my wife's room. I have every right." "You lost that right when you put your hands on her." Thomas's voice was low, controlled, but there was violence underneath it. "When you beat your pregnant wife so badly that she lost her baby, you lost every right you ever had." For just a second, Julian's mask slipped. Thomas saw it, the flash of genuine emotion. Not guilt, not remorse. Anger. Anger at being challenged, at being accused. Then the mask was back. "I have no idea what you're talking about," Julian said calmly. "Caroline fell. She fell down the stairs in our penthouse. It was an accident, a tragic accident. Wasn't it, Caroline?" Thomas looked back at his daughter. She was staring at Julian with an expression Thomas had never seen before. Not fear, not sadness. Something harder. Something that looked almost like hatred. "Yes," she said quietly. "I fell." Julian smiled. "You see? Now, I'd appreciate it if you'd give me a moment alone with my wife." "No." "I'm sorry." Thomas stepped closer, close enough that Julian had to look up slightly to meet his eyes. "I said no. You're not going to be alone with her. Not now, not ever again. Because I'm taking her home with me. And if you try to stop me, if you try to contact her, if you so much as breathe in her direction, I will make sure the entire world knows what you did." Julian laughed. Actually laughed. "With what proof? You have nothing. The doctors will confirm that Caroline's injuries are consistent with a fall. The hospital records will show that she was treated for an accidental trauma. There's no evidence of anything else." He was right. Thomas knew he was right. But he also knew something Julian didn't. He knew how to be patient. "Maybe not yet," Thomas said quietly. "But I will. And when I do, I'm going to bury you." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. Then Julian's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and his expression changed. Whatever was on that screen, it was important. "This conversation is over," Julian said. "Caroline, I'll be back tomorrow. We have things to discuss." He left without another word, without touching her, without even looking back. As soon as the door closed, Caroline let out a breath she'd been holding. "Dad, you can't." "I can. And I will." Thomas sat back down beside her, taking her hand again. "But first, I need you to do something for me. I need you to come back to Portland. Stay with me, just for a while, let yourself heal." "Julian won't allow it. Julian doesn't have a choice." "You're an adult. You can go where you want." "You don't understand. If I leave, if I try to divorce him, he'll make sure I get nothing. The prenup, I don't care about the money." "But I do!" Caroline's voice cracked. "I don't want his money because I love it. I want it because it's the only power I have. If I walk away with nothing, I'm trapped. I have no career anymore, no references. I've been out of the workforce for 3 years. Who's going to hire me? I'll be starting from zero, and meanwhile, Julian will be living in that penthouse, moving on with his life like nothing happened, like our daughter never existed." Thomas felt something click into place. Caroline wasn't just broken. She was angry. And that anger, properly directed, could be powerful. "Then we make sure he doesn't get away with it," Thomas said. "Not the beating. Not the baby. Not any of it. But to do that, you need to be smart. You need to play along for now." Caroline looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean you go home with him. You let him think you're staying, that you're too scared to leave. But while you're there, you gather evidence. Photos of injuries, recordings of him losing his temper, medical records, bank statements. Anything that proves what kind of man he really is. And when we have enough, when we have everything we need, we take him down, all the way down." "Dad, That could take months, maybe years. I know, and it might not even work. He's too powerful. Maybe, but it's the only play we have. Thomas squeezed her hand. Unless you want to walk away right now. Come back to Portland, start over, let him win. I'll support you either way. Whatever you choose, I'm with you. Caroline was quiet for a long time. Thomas could see her thinking, weighing her options, calculating the costs. Finally, she looked up at him. I want him to suffer, she said. The way he made me suffer. The way he made our daughter suffer. Then let's make that happen. Over the next week, Thomas became a student of Julian Hargrave's life. He went back to Portland, but he didn't go back to work. Instead, he spent 16 hours a day at his computer researching, learning everything he could about the Hargrave family, about their businesses, about Julian specifically. The Hargraves had built their fortune on real estate, but they had diversified over the years. Now they had their fingers in everything: hotels, restaurants, venture capital, even a few tech startups. Julian himself sat on the board of several companies, played golf with senators, donated to the right charities. He was careful, smart. He had built a public image of success and sophistication. But Thomas had learned a long time ago that the shinier something looked on the outside, the more rot there usually was underneath. He started digging into Julian's business dealings, SEC filings, investor reports, court records. It was tedious work, made harder by the fact that Thomas wasn't a lawyer or an accountant. But he was methodical. He took notes. He followed threads. And slowly, patterns began to emerge. Julian had been involved in 3 separate business ventures that had failed spectacularly in the last 5 years. Each time, investors had lost millions, while Julian himself had walked away unscathed. The lawsuits had been settled quietly, swept under the rug with NDAs and confidentiality agreements. But the records were there, buried in legal databases if you knew where to look. Thomas made copies of everything. He also started looking into Julian's personal life, social media, tabloid photos, charity event attendance lists. Julian was careful about his public image, but he wasn't invisible. Thomas found photos of him at clubs in Miami, at parties in the Hamptons, always with the same group of wealthy, beautiful people who seemed to move through life like they were untouchable. And then Thomas found something interesting. A young woman named Vanessa Chen, 24 years old, an art gallery assistant in Chelsea. She appeared in several photos with Julian, always in the background, never prominently featured, but there. At a gallery opening 2 months before Caroline's beating, at a restaurant in Soho 3 weeks before, at a hotel bar just days before Julian's business trip to London. Thomas dug deeper. Vanessa had an Instagram account. It was public, filled with artsy photos of New York City, museum visits, cocktails with friends, and buried in her stories from 6 weeks ago, visible only because Thomas went back through her archived highlights, was a photo. Just a glimpse of a man's hand on a restaurant table. Expensive watch. A ring on the 4th finger. The same watch Julian wore. The same ring Caroline had given him for their first anniversary. Julian was having an affair. Thomas sat back in his chair, staring at the screen. This was leverage. Real leverage. If Caroline filed for divorce and could prove infidelity, the prenup might not hold up. They would need more evidence, photos, witnesses, something concrete. But this was a start. He called Caroline that night. She was back in the penthouse. Julian had insisted, of course. He needed to maintain the appearance of a happy marriage. Needed to make sure Caroline didn't talk to anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions. "How are you feeling?" Thomas asked when she answered. "Empty." Her voice was flat. "The doctor said I can't have children anymore. The damage was too severe. Julian knows. He doesn't seem to care." Thomas closed his eyes, feeling a fresh wave of rage wash over him. "I'm sorry, baby." "Don't be sorry, just tell me you found something. Tell me this isn't for nothing." I found something, Thomas said. Julian's having an affair with a woman named Vanessa Chen. I don't have proof yet, but I'm working on it. If we can prove it, the prenup might be void. There was a long pause. Then quietly, I already knew. What? About the affairs. There have been others. I found receipts, hotel bookings, text messages. I confronted him once, about a year ago. He said it didn't mean anything, that it was just physical, that I should be grateful he was discreet about it. Thomas felt sick. Caroline, I stayed anyway, because I thought if I could just be good enough, patient enough, if I could give him a child, he would change. He would choose me. Her voice broke. I was so stupid. You're not stupid. You were trying to survive. Well, I survived. And now what? We gather evidence of his affairs, take him to court, hope a judge feels sorry for me? The Hargraves will bury us, Dad. You know they will. Then we don't play by their rules, Thomas said. We make our own. What does that mean? Thomas had been thinking about this for days, turning it over in his mind, examining it from every angle. What he was considering wasn't legal. It might not even be moral, but it was effective. It means we hit him where it hurts most, Thomas said. Not in court, not in the press, in his wallet. I don't understand. Julian's businesses are built on reputation, on the Hargrave name meaning something, meaning prestige, reliability, success. But if that reputation gets damaged, if investors start to doubt, if partners start to pull out, if the public starts to see Julian for what he really is, the whole thing could collapse. The Hargraves have power because people believe in them. We take away that belief. We take away their power. And how do we do that? Thomas smiled, though there was no warmth in it. We expose him. Everything. The affairs, the failed businesses, the violence. We don't go through the courts. We go directly to the people who matter. His investors, his business partners, his family's social circle. We make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man Julian Hargrave is. That won't be enough. His family will spin it. They'll make me look like the villain. Not if we're smart about it. Not if we have undeniable proof, and not if we time it perfectly. Thomas leaned forward, his voice intense. You said Julian has a big investor meeting coming up next month, right? The one with the Singapore consortium? Yes. It's the biggest deal his family has ever attempted. Almost $2 billion in foreign investment for their new hotel chain. If it goes through, Julian will be the golden boy of the family. If it fails, he becomes a liability. And the Hargraves don't tolerate liabilities. Caroline was quiet, processing. Then, what do you need me to do? I need you to document everything. Keep a journal. Save every text message, every email. If he hurts you again, take photos immediately. If he brings women to the penthouse, record it. If he talks about business dealings, remember the details. You're inside now. You have access to things no one else does. Use it. And what are you going to do? I'm going to build a case. Not a legal case. A public one. I'm going to find every person Julian has ever screwed over, every woman he's cheated with, every business partner he's betrayed. And when the time is right, we're going to show the world who he really is. Another pause. Then, for the first time since the hospital, Thomas heard something in his daughter's voice that sounded like hope. Okay, Caroline said. Let's do it. Over the next 6 weeks, Thomas became a ghost. He traveled to New York quietly, staying in cheap motels in Queens, moving carefully through Julian's world without leaving traces. He talked to people, former employees of Hargrave companies who had been fired suddenly, investors who had lost money in Julian's failed ventures, women who had dated him before Caroline. Some people wouldn't talk. Some were too scared of the Hargrave lawyers. But others were angry. Others had been waiting for someone to finally stand up to Julian. Thomas recorded everything. He built a database of evidence that painted a picture of a man who was charming on the surface but rotten underneath. A man who used people and discarded them. A man who believed his money made him untouchable. Meanwhile, Caroline played her part. She stayed in the penthouse, played the dutiful wife, attended Julian's business dinners and charity events. And all the while, she documented. She took photos of new bruises when Julian's temper flared. She recorded arguments. She made copies of financial documents Julian left carelessly around the apartment. She also started seeing a therapist, discreetly, paying in cash, making sure Julian never knew. The therapist helped her understand what she'd been living through, helped her name it. Domestic violence, coercive control, intimate partner abuse. And slowly, Caroline began to heal. Not physically. Those scars would always be there, but mentally. She began to remember who she was before Julian, who she could be after him. The Singapore investor meeting was scheduled for November 15th, 3 months after Caroline lost the baby. 3 months of planning and gathering evidence and building their case. Thomas flew to New York 2 days before the meeting. He met Caroline in a coffee shop in Brooklyn, far from anywhere Julian might see them. She looked different. Thinner, yes, but stronger somehow. There was steel in her eyes now. "I have everything," she said, sliding a USB drive across the table. Financial documents showing Julian's been embezzling from his family's company. Photos of injuries he caused, with dates and times. Recordings of him threatening me. Text messages between him and Vanessa, explicit ones. And statements from 2 other women he was involved with who are willing to go on record. Thomas took the drive, feeling its weight in his palm. This is enough. This is more than enough. What happens now? Now we burn it all down. Thomas had spent weeks preparing for this moment. He had created anonymous email accounts. He had compiled the evidence into clear, undeniable packages, and he had identified exactly who needed to see it. The Singapore investors, the Hargrave family's board of directors, Julian's business partners, and the press. On the morning of November 14th, Thomas sent the emails. Within hours, the entire carefully constructed world Julian Hargrave had built began to collapse. Julian Hargrave woke up on the morning of November 15th, believing it was going to be the best day of his life. The Singapore deal was as good as done. $2 billion in foreign investment flowing into Hargrave International. His father, Richard Hargrave, a man who had never been impressed by anything Julian had accomplished, would finally have to acknowledge him. Finally have to admit that Julian wasn't just riding on the family name, that he was a force in his own right. Julian stood in front of the mirror in his penthouse bathroom, adjusting his tie. Hermes, deep blue silk. It had cost $3,000, but it was worth it. Today, appearance mattered. Today, he needed to look like exactly what he was, a man who had everything under control. Behind him, through the open bathroom door, he could see Caroline still in bed. She had barely moved all morning, barely moved much at all in the last few months, really. She had become a ghost in their home, drifting from room to room, speaking only when spoken to. It was better this way, Julian thought. She had finally learned her place. The baby situation had been unfortunate. He hadn't meant for that to happen. He had just been so angry that night. She had questioned him about staying out late, had looked at him with those judgmental eyes, and something inside him had snapped. He had hit her before, of course, a slap here, a shove there. But that night had been different. That night, he had lost control. And then the baby had died, and suddenly there were complications. Doctors asking careful questions. Hospital staff looking at him with barely concealed suspicion. For a few days, Julian had worried. But the Hargrave lawyers had handled it. They always did. The hospital records showed an accidental fall. Caroline hadn't contradicted the story, and eventually, everyone had moved on. Everyone except Thomas. Julian's jaw tightened at the thought of Caroline's father. The man was a problem. Had been since that night at the hospital when he'd stood there making empty threats. "I'm going to bury you." Julian had laughed it off at the time. What could a contractor from Portland possibly do to him? But lately there had been irregularities. Small things. Phone calls from business associates asking strange questions. Investors requesting additional documentation on projects that had been settled years ago. Nothing concrete. Nothing Julian could point to and say definitively that Thomas was behind it. Still, it made him uneasy. Julian shook off the thought. Today wasn't about Thomas Brennan. Today was about securing his legacy. He left the penthouse at 8:30, driven to the Hargrave International headquarters in Midtown by his private driver. The building was a monument to his family's success, 42 stories of glass and steel, the Hargrave name emblazoned across the top in letters 10 feet tall. Julian's phone buzzed as he rode the elevator to the executive floor. A text from his assistant. The Singapore delegation arrived early. They're waiting in the conference room. Also, your father wants to see you before the meeting. His office. Now. Julian frowned. His father never wanted to see him before important meetings. Richard Hargrave believed in letting his children sink or swim on their own. The fact that he was asking for a meeting now was unusual. Julian found his father standing behind his desk, staring out the window at the Manhattan skyline. Richard Hargrave was 73 years old, but he carried himself like a man 20 years younger. Silver hair, expensive suit. The kind of presence that made people instinctively step aside when he entered a room. "You wanted to see me?" Julian said. Richard didn't turn around. "Close the door." Julian did, feeling the first flutter of genuine unease. "Is something wrong?" "That depends." Richard finally turned, and his expression made Julian's stomach drop. It was cold. Disappointed. The look Julian had spent his entire life trying to avoid. "Did you think I wouldn't find out?" "Find out about what?" Richard reached for something on his desk, a tablet, and held it up. On the screen was an email. Julian couldn't see the details from where he stood, but he could see enough. Attachments. Documents. Photos. "I received this at 6 o'clock this morning," Richard said, his voice dangerously calm. "So did every member of our board of directors. So did our legal team. And so did the Singapore investors currently waiting downstairs." Julian felt the blood drain from his face. "What is it?" "Evidence. Quite a lot of it, actually. Evidence that you've been embezzling from company accounts. Evidence of several extramarital affairs. Evidence that you've been involved in multiple failed business ventures that you conveniently forgot to disclose to this family. And evidence," Richard's voice turned to ice, "that you beat your pregnant wife so severely she lost her child and can never have children again." The room seemed to tilt. Julian grabbed the back of a chair to steady himself. Those are lies. Someone is trying to sabotage. I had our forensic accountants review the financial documents in these emails. They're real, Julian. The bank records, the transfers, all of it. You've been stealing from your own family for at least 2 years. I can explain. And the photographs. Richard set the tablet down, his hands perfectly steady. The medical records? The voice recordings of you threatening Caroline? Can you explain those too? Julian's mind was racing. Thomas. This had to be Thomas. But how? How had that man gotten access to financial records? To medical files? To recordings Julian didn't even know existed? The Singapore deal, Julian said desperately. We can still... The Singapore deal is dead. Their delegation received the same emails. They left the building 10 minutes ago. $2 billion, Julian. The biggest opportunity this family has ever had, and you destroyed it. I didn't. You did. Richard moved closer, and Julian had to fight the urge to step back. You have embarrassed this family. You have jeopardized our reputation. You have committed crimes that could send you to prison. But more than that. Richard's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. You have proven that I was right about you all along. You are weak. You are cruel. And you are stupid. The words hit harder than any physical blow. Julian opened his mouth to respond, to defend himself, but nothing came out. You're done, Richard said. Effective immediately, you are removed from the board of Hargrave International. You are removed from all family business interests. Your trust fund is frozen pending investigation. And if the authorities decide to press charges, and I suspect they will not have the benefit of the family's legal team. You're on your own. You can't do this. I'm your son. You were my son. Now you're just a liability. Richard walked back to his desk, sitting down, already dismissing Julian from his attention. Security will escort you from the building. Don't come back. Julian stood there, frozen, unable to process what was happening. This wasn't possible. He was a Hargrave. The rules didn't apply to him. They never had. But as security guards appeared in the doorway, as they quietly but firmly guided him toward the elevator, Julian realized something with dawning horror. His father wasn't going to save him. The family lawyers weren't going to protect him. His money, his name, his power, all of it had been stripped away in the space of a single conversation. He was alone. The next 48 hours were a blur. The story broke in the press within hours. The tabloids got hold of the emails first, running with the salacious details. Hargrave heir in domestic violence scandal. Billionaire's son accused of beating pregnant wife. Singapore deal collapses amid embezzlement allegations. By evening, the mainstream news had picked it up. Cable networks ran segments. Legal analysts speculated about potential criminal charges. Business journalists analyzed what this meant for Hargrave International's reputation, and social media exploded. Caroline's photo, a professional headshot from before she married Julian, circulated everywhere. So did photos of Julian at clubs, at parties, with various women who weren't his wife. Anonymous sources began coming forward. Former employees who said Julian was abusive to staff. Women who claimed he had harassed them. Business partners who said he was a fraud. Some of it was true. Some of it was exaggerated. But all of it created a narrative that the public eagerly consumed. A wealthy, privileged man who thought he was above consequences finally being held accountable. Julian locked himself in the penthouse, ignoring phone calls, deleting social media apps, trying to figure out how to salvage any part of his life. His lawyer, his personal lawyer, not the family's, told him the embezzlement case was strong, that prosecutors were already talking about indictments, that he needed to prepare for the possibility of prison time. Prison. Julian had never even considered it. Men like him didn't go to prison. They paid fines. They did community service. They waited for the news cycle to move on, and then they quietly rebuilt their lives. But his lawyer's voice had been grim. This isn't just bad, Julian. This is catastrophic. The financial crimes alone could put you away for 10 years. And if they charge you for what happened to your wife... Julian had hung up. On the second day, Caroline left. Julian had been in his study, drinking scotch at 10 in the morning, when he heard movement in the bedroom. He walked out to find Caroline packing a suitcase. Not everything. Just enough. "What are you doing?" he asked. She didn't look at him. "Leaving." "You can't leave." "Yes, I can." She folded a sweater carefully, placing it in the suitcase. "In fact, I should have left a long time ago." Julian felt panic rising. If Caroline left, if she testified against him, it was over. Everything was over. Caroline, please, we can work through this. I know I made mistakes, but... Mistakes? She finally looked at him, and the expression in her eyes made him take a step back. It wasn't fear, it wasn't sadness. It was contempt. You beat me. You killed our baby. You destroyed any chance I had at being a mother. Those aren't mistakes, Julian. Those are crimes. I didn't mean... Yes, you did. You meant every hit, every insult, every moment of cruelty. And you thought you'd get away with it because of your name, your money, your power. But you were wrong. Julian moved closer, his voice becoming desperate. If you leave, if you testify, they'll tear you apart in court. My lawyers will make you look unstable, vindictive. They'll say you're just after money. You don't have lawyers anymore. Your family cut you off, remember? Caroline zipped the suitcase. And I don't want your money. I never wanted your money. I just wanted you to love me. But you can't love anyone. You can only control them. And I'm done being controlled. She walked past him, pulling the suitcase behind her. Where will you go? Julian called after her. Caroline paused at the door. Somewhere you'll never find me. And then she was gone. Julian stood in the empty penthouse, surrounded by expensive furniture and million-dollar views, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fear. 3 days later, the criminal charges were filed. Assault, domestic violence, embezzlement, wire fraud. The prosecutor was a woman in her 40s named Rebecca Chen, no relation to Vanessa as it turned out, though the coincidence was bitter, who had built her career on taking down powerful men who abused their positions. She held a press conference on the courthouse steps. For too long, wealthy individuals have used their resources to escape accountability for violent crimes, she said, cameras flashing around her. Today we are sending a message that no one is above the law. No matter how much money you have, no matter what family you come from, if you commit violence against another person, you will face justice. Julian watched the press conference on television from a hotel room in Queens. He had been forced to leave the penthouse. The board had seized it as a company asset, part of their investigation into his financial crimes. Everything he owned was being frozen, examined, itemized. He was living on the $1,000 cash he'd had in his wallet when his world collapsed. His phone buzzed. A blocked number. Julian almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Hello? Mr. Hargrave. The voice was unfamiliar, male, calm. My name is Detective Morrison. I'm with the NYPD. I'm investigating allegations of domestic violence against your wife, Caroline. I'd like to ask you some questions. I want my lawyer present. Of course. But Mr. Hargrave? You should know, Mrs. Hargrave has agreed to testify. She's provided us with extensive documentation, medical records, photographs, recordings, and she's not the only one. We've spoken to several of your household staff who witnessed incidents of violence, your doorman who saw injuries, a neighbor who heard screaming. Julian felt the walls closing in. I didn't do anything wrong. Then you have nothing to worry about. A pause. We'll be in touch to arrange a formal interview. Until then, I'd advise you not to leave the state. The line went dead. Julian sat on the edge of the hotel bed, head in his hands, and for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to lose. He had lost his family, his business, his reputation. His freedom was likely next. And somewhere out there, Thomas Brennan, a simple contractor from Portland, had orchestrated all of it. Julian wanted to be angry, wanted to feel the rage that usually fueled him, but all he felt was empty. Because the truth was, Thomas hadn't destroyed him. Julian had destroyed himself. Thomas had just made sure everyone else finally saw it. Meanwhile, in Portland, Thomas sat in his living room with Caroline beside him, watching the news coverage. His daughter was staying with him now, healing. Slowly. She had started seeing a trauma therapist 3 times a week. She had enrolled in online classes, business management, something she had always wanted to study. She was building a new life, a free life. "Do you think he'll go to prison?" she asked quietly. "I think so. The prosecution has a strong case, and without his family's protection." Thomas trailed off. Caroline nodded. They sat in silence for a moment, watching Julian's mugshot flash across the screen. He looked smaller somehow, diminished. "Do you regret it?" Thomas asked. "Any of it?" Caroline thought about the question, thought about the months of documentation, of living in fear while gathering evidence, of the risk they had taken. Then she thought about the baby she would never hold, the daughter who would never take her first breath. "No," she said finally. "I don't regret it. He needed to face consequences. For her, if nothing else." Thomas put his arm around his daughter, and she leaned into him, the way she used to when she was little and the world felt too big and scary. "I'm proud of you," he said. "You're stronger than you know. I learned from the best." They sat together as the sun set over Portland, and for the first time in years, Caroline felt something she thought she'd lost forever: hope. The future was uncertain. The legal battles would be long. The healing would take even longer. But she was free. And Julian Hargrave, the man who had taken so much from her, was finally facing the justice he deserved. It wasn't enough. Nothing could bring back her daughter or give her back the years she'd lost. But it was something. And sometimes, something was enough. 6 months later, the trial began. The courthouse in Lower Manhattan was besieged from the moment the sun rose. News vans lined the streets. Protesters held signs, some supporting Caroline, others defending Julian, though those were fewer and grew quieter with each passing day. The world was watching. This wasn't just about one man and one woman anymore. It had become something bigger. A referendum on power, on privilege, on whether justice could truly be blind. Thomas sat in the gallery every single day, front row, directly behind the prosecution table, where Caroline could turn and see him whenever she needed to. She would be testifying. The prosecution had warned them it would be brutal. That Julian's lawyers, he had managed to scrape together enough money for a decent defense team, though nothing like what the Hargrave family could have provided, would try to discredit her, to paint her as vindictive, unstable, a gold digger seeking revenge. But Caroline was ready. She had spent 6 months preparing for this, not just mentally but emotionally. The therapy had helped, so had the distance. So had watching Julian's empire crumble in real time. She understood now that she hadn't been weak for staying as long as she had. She had been surviving, and survival, her therapist had told her, was its own form of strength. Julian looked different when he entered the courtroom on the first day of trial. Thinner, older. His expensive suits had been replaced by off-the-rack clothing. His hair was graying at the temples. He moved with the careful, diminished posture of someone who had learned what it meant to be powerless. When his eyes met Thomas's across the courtroom, there was no defiance in them, just exhaustion, and something that might have been fear. Good, Thomas thought. Let him be afraid. The prosecution's opening statement was devastating. Rebecca Chen stood before the jury, 8 women, 4 men, all carefully selected, and laid out a story of systematic abuse. She showed photos of Caroline's injuries, medical records documenting broken bones and internal bleeding. She played audio recordings of Julian threatening Caroline, his voice cold and controlled even as he described what he would do to her if she ever left him. "This is not a case about a marriage gone wrong," Chen said, her voice carrying through the silent courtroom. "This is a case about power and control, about a man who believed his wealth made him untouchable, who believed he could hurt the woman he claimed to love without consequence. and about the child who paid the ultimate price for his violence. When she projected the ultrasound image on the screen, the last photo ever taken of Caroline's daughter just days before she died, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Even one of the bailiffs had to look away. Julian's lawyer, a nervous-looking man named Preston Walsh, did his best to counter. He talked about Caroline's history of anxiety, about how complicated marriages could be, about how there were always two sides to every story. But his words felt hollow, desperate, like trying to bail water from a sinking ship with a teaspoon. The trial lasted 4 weeks. Witnesses came forward, one after another, building an undeniable picture of who Julian Hargrave really was. The housekeeper who had seen Caroline with bruises, who had been threatened with deportation when she tried to speak up. The doorman who had watched Caroline leave the building after particularly violent nights had seen the way she flinched when Julian touched her. The doctor who had treated her 3 separate times for accidental injuries. And then there were the other women. 4 of them testified. Women Julian had dated before Caroline. Women he had charmed and controlled and eventually discarded. They told stories that were eerily similar to Caroline's. The gradual isolation from friends and family. The jealous rages. The violence that started small, a grab, a push, and escalated. One woman, a former model named Alicia Romero, broke down on the stand describing how Julian had thrown her down a flight of stairs when she threatened to leave him. She had spent 3 months in physical therapy. She had never pressed charges. The Hargrave lawyers had paid her off, made her sign an NDA. But NDAs meant nothing now. Julian had no power to enforce them anymore. Through it all, Julian sat at the defense table, his face carefully neutral. But Thomas watched him. Watched the way his hands trembled slightly when the photos were shown, the way he closed his eyes when the audio recordings played, the way he never once looked at Caroline. Guilt? Thomas wondered. Or just self-preservation? Caroline testified on day 17. Thomas had been dreading this moment. He knew what it would cost her to relive everything in front of a room full of strangers, to describe the most intimate, painful moments of her life while Julian sat just feet away, listening. But Caroline had insisted. She needed to do this. Not for the prosecution, for herself. She wore a simple navy dress, no jewelry. Her hair pulled back. She looked young and fragile as she took the stand, raising her right hand to swear to tell the truth. But when she began to speak, her voice was steady. Rebecca Chen led her through the testimony gently, starting with how she and Julian had met. The whirlwind courtship, the wedding. When had things changed? When had he first hit her? "It was about 4 months after we got married," Caroline said. "We were at a charity event. I was talking to another man, just talking about art, about nothing important. But Julian saw us, and something in his face just changed. When we got home, he grabbed me by the arm, hard enough to leave bruises, and told me I had embarrassed him, that I made him look weak in front of his colleagues, that I needed to learn my place." "And did the violence escalate from there?" "Yes, slowly at first. A slap, a shove. But then it got worse. He would hit me when he was angry, when he was stressed about work, when I said something he didn't like. Eventually I learned to just be quiet, to not argue, to not give him any reason." "But you stayed." "I stayed." Caroline's voice wavered slightly. "Because I loved him. Because I thought if I could just be better, if I could just make him happy, he would stop. And because I was scared. He told me that if I ever left, he would make sure I lost everything, that no one would believe me, that his family would destroy me." "Were you scared of him?" "Every day. Chen paused, letting that sink in. Then, let's talk about the night of August 7th, the night you lost your baby. Can you tell the jury what happened? Caroline took a deep breath. Thomas could see her hands gripping the edge of the witness stand, knuckles white. But her voice remained steady. Julian had been away for 2 days. A business trip, he said. But I had found evidence that he was with another woman. Credit card statements, hotel bookings. When he came home that night, I confronted him. I asked him if he was having an affair. And what did he say? He said it was none of my business, that what he did outside our marriage didn't concern me. I told him I was pregnant, that I deserved better, that our baby deserved better. And he... Caroline's voice broke. She closed her eyes, took a moment to compose herself. He told me the baby was a mistake, that he never wanted children, that I had trapped him. What happened next? I told him I wanted a divorce. And that's when he hit me. Not a slap this time, a punch to my stomach. I fell and he kept going. He was screaming, saying I was ruining his life, that I was nothing without him. I tried to protect my stomach, but he was stronger. And then everything went dark. Across the courtroom, someone was crying. One of the jurors, a woman in her 60s, had tears streaming down her face. When did you wake up? In the hospital. 3 days later. And they told me my baby was gone. That I would never be able to have children again. That Julian had taken everything from me. Chen let the silence stretch. Then, quietly, do you hold Julian Hargrave responsible for the death of your daughter? Yes. Do you believe he showed any remorse for what he did? Caroline finally looked at Julian. For the first time since entering the courtroom, she looked directly at him. No, he was relieved. I could see it in his face when they told him the baby was gone. He was relieved. The defense's cross-examination was brief and ineffective. Preston Walsh tried to suggest that Caroline's memory of that night was unreliable, that she had been traumatized and confused. He tried to introduce evidence of an old anxiety diagnosis, suggesting she was prone to exaggeration. But Chen objected at every turn, and the judge sustained most of them. The jury wasn't buying it anyway. Thomas could see it in their faces. They had already made up their minds. The trial ended on a Friday afternoon in late March. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the foreperson, a black woman in her 40s, a teacher, stood and read the verdict in a clear, unwavering voice. On the count of assault in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. Julian's head dropped. On the count of aggravated domestic violence, we find the defendant guilty. His lawyer put a hand on his shoulder, but Julian shook it off. On the count of reckless endangerment resulting in death, we find the defendant guilty. Caroline exhaled. Thomas reached forward and squeezed her shoulder. The embezzlement and fraud charges were read next. Guilty on all counts. When the foreperson finally sat down, Julian Hargrave had been convicted on 11 separate felony charges. He was facing anywhere from 25 to 40 years in prison. The judge set sentencing for 3 weeks later. As the bailiffs led Julian away in handcuffs, he looked back one last time. Not at Caroline, at Thomas. Their eyes met across the courtroom, and Thomas saw it, the understanding. Julian knew. He knew that Thomas Brennan, the simple contractor from Portland, had orchestrated his downfall, had brought the full weight of justice down on him when no one else would. And Julian had lost. The sentencing hearing was packed. Victims' statements came first. Caroline spoke, reading from a prepared statement, her voice never wavering. She talked about her daughter, about the life that had been stolen, about the years of fear and pain, about the woman she had been before Julian and the woman she was becoming after. I don't hate you, she said, looking at Julian. I pity you. Because you will spend the rest of your life in a cage, knowing that you threw away everything, your family, your freedom, your chance at redemption. For what? For the fleeting satisfaction of controlling someone weaker than you? You're not a man. You're a coward. And I hope that every day you spend in prison, you think about our daughter, about what she could have been, about the life you stole from her. Alicia Romero spoke next. Then two other women. Then the housekeeper, speaking through a translator, talking about the nightmares she still had. The doorman. Caroline's therapist, describing the psychological damage Julian had caused. By the time they finished, Julian was staring at the table in front of him, his face blank. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Margaret Hernandez, looked at Julian over her reading glasses. "Mr. Hargrave, do you have anything to say before I pass sentence?" Julian stood slowly. For a moment, Thomas thought he might apologize, might show some shred of remorse. Instead, Julian said, "I never meant for any of this to happen. I loved Caroline. I wanted our marriage to work. If she had just been more understanding, none of this would have happened." Even his own lawyer looked horrified. Judge Hernandez's expression hardened. "Mr. Hargrave, in my 23 years on the bench, I have never heard a defendant display such a complete lack of accountability. You have shown no remorse, no understanding of the magnitude of your crimes. You continue to blame your victim for your own violent actions." She looked down at her notes, then back up at Julian. "The state recommends 25 years. I'm going to go higher. On all counts, to be served consecutively, I sentence you to 42 years in a maximum security facility. You will be eligible for parole in 35 years, by which time, Mr. Hargrave, you will be 76 years old. I hope you spend every one of those years reflecting on the lives you destroyed and the woman you could have been fortunate enough to love." The gavel came down. Julian's legs buckled. The bailiffs had to hold him up as they led him away. Outside the courthouse, Caroline and Thomas stood on the steps, surrounded by reporters shouting questions. But Caroline had only prepared one statement. "Justice has been served today," she said, her voice carrying over the noise. "Not just for me, but for every woman who has been told she deserved the abuse she suffered. For every woman who has been afraid to speak up because she knew no one would believe her. For every woman who has lost a child to violence. This verdict says that no one, no matter how wealthy, no matter how powerful, is above the law. I hope it gives other women the courage to come forward, to refuse to be victims, to demand justice." She stepped back, declining to answer questions, and Thomas guided her through the crowd to a waiting car. As they drove away from the courthouse, Caroline was quiet. Thomas worried that the verdict, the finality of it, might hit her harder than she expected, but when he looked over at her, she was smiling. Not a big smile, just a small, peaceful expression. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "I'm thinking about her," Caroline said softly. "My daughter. I never got to name her. But I've been thinking about names. I was going to call her Grace. Grace Elizabeth Brennan. Not Hargrave. Brennan." "That's beautiful," Thomas said, his throat tight. "I want to start a foundation," Caroline continued, "in her name, for women escaping domestic violence, to help them with legal fees, with housing, with starting over. I want Grace's legacy to be something good, something that helps people." Thomas reached over and took her hand. "We'll make it happen. Whatever you need." They drove in silence for a while, heading toward the airport. Caroline was flying back to Portland with Thomas. She had an apartment there now, and a job, working with a nonprofit that helped abuse survivors. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't pay much, but it was hers, built on her own terms. "Dad?" Caroline said quietly. "Yeah, sweetheart. Thank you for not giving up on me." for fighting when I couldn't fight for myself, for being the kind of man who shows me that not all men are like Julian." Thomas felt tears prick his eyes. He pulled the car over, put it in park, and turned to his daughter. "You never have to thank me for that," he said. "I'm your father. I would burn the world down to keep you safe. I would do it all again, every single part, if it meant you could be free." Caroline unbuckled her seatbelt and hugged him, and for a long moment they just held each other. A father and daughter who had been through hell and come out the other side. Scarred, yes, changed, absolutely, but together, and stronger for it. 3 years later, the Grace Elizabeth Brennan Foundation had helped over 200 women escape abusive relationships. Caroline ran it from a small office in Portland, working 16-hour days, pouring everything she had into making sure no woman had to suffer the way she had. She spoke at conferences. She lobbied for stronger domestic violence laws. She became a voice for the voiceless. She never married again, never wanted to. But she wasn't alone. She had friends, genuine friends, people who loved her for who she was, not what she could give them. She had purpose, she had peace, and she had her father. Thomas had sold his contracting business and joined Caroline at the foundation, handling finances and operations. They made a good team. Every morning they arrived at the office together. Every evening they had dinner together. They talked about the women they were helping, about the legislation they were trying to pass, about the future. They never talked about Julian. He was in a maximum security prison in upstate New York, serving his 42-year sentence. Caroline received letters from him occasionally, apologies, pleas for forgiveness, promises that he had changed. She never opened them. She had a staff member shred them unread. Julian Hargrave no longer existed in her world. He was a lesson learned. A chapter closed. Nothing more. On what would have been Grace's 3rd birthday, Caroline and Thomas went to the cemetery where Caroline had buried a small memorial stone. Not a grave. There was no body to bury. Just a marker. A place to remember. They brought flowers, daisies, Caroline's favorite. "I think about her every day," Caroline said, kneeling beside the stone. "I wonder what she would have looked like, what her laugh would have sounded like, what kind of person she would have become." Thomas knelt beside her, putting his arm around her shoulders. "She would have been just like you, strong, compassionate, brave." "I hope so." They sat there for a while, watching the sun set over Portland, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. And in that moment, despite everything they had lost, despite all the pain and suffering, Thomas felt something unexpected. Gratitude, because his daughter was alive. She was healing. She was making a difference in the world. And Julian Hargrave, the man who had tried to break her, had lost everything while Caroline had found herself. That was justice. Not just the verdict, not just the prison sentence, but this. Caroline, free and whole and building a life worth living. A life that honored her daughter's memory by helping others. As they walked back to the car, Caroline's phone buzzed. A text from one of the women the foundation was helping. "Thank you for saving my life. Because of you, I got out. Because of you, my kids are safe. You gave us hope." Caroline showed the message to Thomas, and he saw tears in her eyes. But they were good tears, healing tears. "That's why we do this," she said. "That's why Grace's story matters. So other children don't have to lose their lives. So other women don't have to lose their futures." Thomas pulled his daughter close, kissing the top of her head. "I'm proud of you, Caro. Your mother would be so proud. And Grace. Grace would be proud too." They drove home together through the Portland streets as evening fell around them. And for the first time since that terrible night in the penthouse, since the baby was lost and the world fell apart. Caroline felt something she thought she would never feel again. Peace. She had survived. She had fought. She had won. And Julian Hargrave, locked in his prison cell, powerless and forgotten, had lost everything. That was the real justice. Not revenge, not punishment for its own sake, but a father's promise kept, a daughter's life reclaimed, and a legacy of hope built from the ashes of tragedy. In the end, this wasn't just a story about wealth and power. It was a story about love. A father's love for his daughter, strong enough to move mountains and tear down empires. It was about resilience, a woman finding her strength in the darkest moment of her life. And it was about justice, real justice, the kind that doesn't just punish the guilty, but lifts up the survivors. Julian Hargrave learned too late that money can't buy everything. It can't buy immunity from consequences. It can't buy back the lives you've destroyed. And it certainly can't buy redemption when you've never truly understood what you've done wrong. Thomas Brennan, a simple contractor from Portland, proved that you don't need billions to change the world. You just need courage, determination, and love fierce enough to fight for what's right. And Caroline, survivor, advocate, and the strongest person in this entire story, showed that broken things can be mended. That trauma doesn't have to define you. That even in the darkest night, there can be a dawn. Her daughter, Grace Elizabeth Brennan, never took a breath. But her legacy lives on in every woman saved, every child protected, every life transformed by the foundation that bears her name. Some stories don't have happy endings, but this one has something better. Hope.